Welcome to Truth Watch, where we go beyond the headlines to uncover the stories, the choices, and the lessons behind every event. Let's dive in.
Today, we're opening a case file, but this isn't about one single crime. It's about the psychology of the crime itself. We're going to take a look inside the mind of a killer to try and understand the mechanics that can actually lead a person to take a life. It's a question that haunts our stories, our news, everything. Why do people kill? But, if you step back from the headlines and our own worst fears, what does the science actually have to say about it? Let's deconstruct this piece by piece and just see what kind of picture starts to form. So, first things first, let's clear away some of the big myths. We have this tendency to sort killers into these two really simple boxes. They're either mad or they're bad. But the reality, according to the research, is, well, it's a lot more complex and, frankly, a lot more unsettling. The data shows that the vast majority of people who kill aren't some kind of evil mastermind or clinically insane. They are psychologically normal individuals who've been pushed past a breaking point. Okay, so if it's not usually about madness, then what is it? Our analysis has to start with the spark, right? The immediate cause that ignites the violence. And that is the emotional trigger. To figure this out, researchers conducted this massive analysis, looking at over 1,700 cases of mass murder from all over the world. And what they found, well, it pretty much turns our common assumptions completely upside down. It turns out that severe mental illness, like psychosis, was rarely the main thing driving the violence. How rarely? Just look at this number. 9.6%. In less than 1 out of every 10 cases was the act primarily motivated by psychosis. I mean, that single number completely changes the public conversation about why these terrible events happen. So if it's not psychosis, what is the most common driver? Well, the study found that nearly 58%, so the huge majority, were impulsive and emotionally driven acts. They typically just exploded in the aftermath of some major life crisis. And when we actually break down what those emotional triggers are, we're not looking at some kind of abstract evil motivation. What we're seeing is explosive rage, a bitter grudge, romantic rejection, profound despair. I mean, these are powerful and tragically human emotions that, in these very specific cases, just spiraled into absolute catastrophe. But here's the thing. An emotional trigger by itself usually isn't enough. It's like a spark, but it has to land on a very specific kind of kindling. So now let's add the next layer to our profile, the underlying personality structure that makes someone, well, dangerously flammable. In psychology, this predisposition is often understood through a concept called the dark tetrad. Now, this isn't a diagnosis you get from a doctor. Think of it more like a constellation of 4 distinct but related personality traits that can lead to some really antisocial and harmful behaviors. So let's break these down real quick. First, you have psychopathy, this profound lack of empathy, often coupled with impulsivity. Then there's narcissism, that grandiose sense of self-importance that just craves admiration. Third, Machiavellianism. This is where people see others as just pawns to be manipulated for their own personal gain. And finally, sadism, which is actually taking pleasure from the suffering of other people. And while each of those traits is unique, they all share this dark core. Researchers find that people who are high in these traits tend to be manipulative, they lack empathy, and they're prone to deception. And all of that creates a personality that's primed to act on those intense emotional triggers we just saw, but without the normal internal brakes that most of us have. So we've got the trigger and the personality. But where does a personality like that even come from? To really understand the why of murder, we have to look further back, way back, into an individual's past. Yeah, violent acts don't just appear out of thin air. They often have incredibly deep roots. And research shows again and again that the pathway to adult violence often starts with trauma in childhood. And some studies have traced this tragically clear pathway. Researchers who followed individuals for many, many years found that childhood maltreatment, we're talking physical abuse and neglect, often leads to this deep insecurity and anxiety in adult relationships. And this attachment anxiety, as they call it, was a major predictor for later arrests for violent crimes. It's just a clear, heartbreaking progression from victim to perpetrator. Okay, this brings us to what might be the most difficult part of the whole puzzle. If most people who kill are, psychologically speaking, normal and have a natural aversion to hurting others, How do they get past that fundamental inhibition? Well, the answer seems to lie in a series of psychological maneuvers. It's like a kind of mental gymnastics that allows a person to basically write themselves a permission slip to do something that would otherwise be absolutely unthinkable. Psychologists call this whole process moral disengagement, and it's basically a cognitive toolkit that lets someone switch off their own conscience. It's how a person can commit violence and still see themselves as a moral person. So what's in this toolkit? Well, it contains a few specific mental tricks. An offender might frame their violence as some sort of noble act, like they're protecting their own kind. They might dehumanize their victims, viewing them as objects or even animals. They can diffuse responsibility, telling themselves, hey, I was just following orders. And finally, they can just choose to ignore or minimize the horrific harm they're actually causing. Okay, so let's bring all this evidence together. We've got the trigger, the personality, the origins, and the justification. It's time to assemble the final profile in our case file. Criminological research has a great term for this, a psycho-behavioral footprint. It's the unique psychological signature that an offender leaves behind, a signature that's built from their motivations, their personality, and their behavior. So here it is, the complete sequence. It often starts with a traumatic past, which helps forge a dark personality. Then an intense emotional trigger provides that spark. And finally, moral justification gives the permission to act. All of these elements come together to create that psycho-behavioral footprint. There is this powerful quote from researcher Scott Atran that really just sums it all up. The capacity for lethal violence isn't something we're born with. It's an apathy that has to be learned, it has to be cultivated, and then it has to be aimed at a target through these very psychological processes. And that really brings us to the most important question of all. Understanding this psychological footprint is never, ever about excusing violence. It's about preventing it. If we can see the pathway that leads to these acts, can we find ways to intervene? Can we disrupt this tragic equation before it's too late? That's the challenge this research leaves us with.
Crime doesn't begin with violence. It begins in the mind. And prevention begins with awareness. The more we understand patterns, warning signs, and human psychology, the less power fear has over us. Stay aware, stay informed, stay thoughtful. This is Truth Watch, where we look deeper.